Greetings and welcome to Creative Briefing, an ad hoc live streamed internet show that hopes to explore and discuss all what it means to be creative and encourage everyone to explore their own creativity in whatever shape or form that might take. Well, I've got the purple light on, which means it's Friday fun. I'm going to messing around with some music. And today, I'm really excited to break out the big boy. And by that, I mean, I've looked at virtual synthesizers, I've looked at soft synths, I've looked at vintage emulations and vintage modeling synthesizers, but today I'm going to be demonstrating an actual proper hardware synth, an analog synthesizer. Now, digital has come a long way in recent years, and there's always been a bit of a purist attitude to analog synths, much like, you know, valve amps or tube amps in the guitarist world. You know, purists will say that, you know, there's a sort of certain stigma about valve amps, right? So the similar thing with synthesizers, that analog synths are like the sort of, you know, there's a purity to them, and there is something about, you know, an analog synth that is really fun and hands-on, as we'll get to. The sound quality, like I say, of digital has come a long way, and I will demonstrate like an actual hardware digital synth, so we can see the difference between them on another day. But today I'm going to just be looking at a proper hardware analog synth. So what I have is a Behringer Neutron. It's a monosynth. Analog synths tend to be bigger and bulkier. Obviously, everything is controlled by voltage control. Electrical signals get passed around, and the value and the amount of voltage determines whatever feature that's happens there. Beneath the metal surface here, there is, you know, electronic components that manage and manipulate the electrical signal. Digital synths obviously have integrated circuits, silicon chips, and they're much more compact. So what I'm demonstrating today is a monosynth, which means it can play one sound at a time, one voice at a time. Analog polysynths, polyphonic synths, tend to be really huge. Obviously, the more voices takes, you know, double the amount of componentry under the hood. So this is a fairly compact monosynth, like a desktop synth. It doesn't have a keyboard. I'm using the Arturia key step here, which is just a MIDI controller, and it is sending the signal, the electronic CV signals, over CV cables, and not MIDI, which is a difference too. So monosynth, it can play one note at a time. It can't play chords, so monosynths tend to be good for bass and lead lines, where you're really playing, you know, one sort of note in a phrase. It can't play chords. A polyphonic synthesizer would need to do that. Now it has two oscillators, so it does have two oscillators, and those can be combined to make a sound. So you're not limited to one sound. You can play two sounds effectively. Essentially what it is, you have, and this knob at the top here kind of mixes between them. So when you start to mix, you know, when the mix knob is somewhere between the extremes, you get so I'm going to focus on one of these at a time, so we can talk about what the oscillators do. We have a number of oscillators, you can see down the side here, And the oscillator is, when a guitar string is plucked, when a piano key is pressed and the string is hammered, it causes that string to vibrate. When a drum is struck, it causes the drum head to vibrate. Those are oscillations. The waveform, the rate and the manner in which the air is vibrated determines the sort of timbre, the quality of the sound. So if we start all the way down at the purest wave, which is a sine wave, and that's just like an S curve on its side, and it's just gently oscillating, vibrating back and forth, and that's a very gentle and subtle sort of sound. So then we go up, we start to sharpen some of the edges, let's say, and as we do that, go through triangle to what is called a sawtooth. It's a triangle with a straight edge, to square, and a harmonic, a square wave for the harmonics. So as you can see, that each successive step away from the pure sine wave starts to get more brittle, more bright, more sharp, and that's how we start to craft our sound. Now, obviously, pitch has a lot to do with the oscillator too, and that's what this big tuning knob is. Much like a guitar string needs to be tuned, or a piano or a drum head, needs to be tuned, analog synthesizers are no different. So let's get it brighter so we can hear it. This big tuning knob will allow us to tune this instrument to maybe other analog instruments, like a guitar or a piano or something else we might have, or just other analog synths, because again, much like valve amplifiers in the guitar world, no two set of tubes or valves are alike, no two analog oscillators are alike, so there's going to always be fluctuations, and that's kind of part of the beauty of it. Like vinyl purists will say there's a quality and a beauty to playing a song on vinyl that you don't get with digital, ones and zeros on a compact disc. Whether that's true or not, whether it's just perception or snobbery, that's a debate for another day. I'm just saying that though these are some of the arguments that are made to sort of to support a certain viewpoint and certain characteristics that are applied. So the tuning knob allows us to tune and address some of those inconsistencies with the oscillator. It also allows us, when we have the two oscillators playing in a voice, while I have two oscillators, they're both being played at the same time and sent through the remaining circuitry at the same time. So that is typical of monophonic synth. You might have 2, 3, 4 oscillators, which allows us to craft a sound, craft our voice, but we can only play one voice, one note at a time. So with this sound, you can see that I have a... So what I can do is tune the two voices to be at harmonic intervals. They can either be at the same pitch, or at least the same note. Obviously I have a lower note and a higher note, and that's where this range comes in. We have, it's common to have a certain bracket of ranges for the oscillator, and in this case I have 3 on the Neutron. I have an all, which gives just the full range, from whale hearing through normal human hearing up to dog hearing. So it can be good for special effects and things like that, but not always the most practical when we're trying to craft a sound from music. So but the option is there to select it. So we have a low, a medium, and a high sort of range of control voltage for the oscillator. I'm going to set this back to the medium and set it all the way down to its lowest setting. Now for the on the other oscillator, I have this set to the low so I can get like a nice thick sound. I can also detune it slightly to get, you know, the more we detune it, the thicker the sound starts to get as we introduce some sort of clashing harmonics. So I'm going to put this up to around, I think it was a fifth. So that's what the tuning allows us to do, and this section here is the oscillators. These knobs control the pulse width, like the phase, sort of where the oscillation sort of shape begins and ends. So it changes subtly the sort of harmonics and some of the tones. So if we can demonstrate that with. There I'm sort of varying the pulse width for the square wave, which just basically means in the life of the waveform, is the square wave at this sort of part, or is it more at this sort of part? I mean, that's the best I can describe it, waving my fingers in the air without an oscilloscope. But just know that this section here controls the oscillators, what they do and how they create the bass, the core sound. From that point on, we're now shaping the sound. This sort of synthesizer, an analog monosynth, it's known as subtractive synthesis. We create we generate our tone, our waveform, and then we start chiseling away at it with various parameters to craft our tone. We're subtracting elements away to sort of get to the tone we want. And the first step along that path will be the filter, a voltage controlled filter. And this is like a very special sort of EQ that is swept along by this dial here. So you can see it when the filter is wide open. We get the full tone. As we sweep through it, it starts to subtract tones until we get nothing. And this type of filter is called a low-pass filter. Low-pass, as I've talked in some of my other EQing topics, that low-pass equals high cut. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting the high frequencies, allowing the low frequencies to pass through the filter, until no frequencies pass through the filter. We also have a high pass filter, low cut filter, which will cut the low frequencies and let the high frequencies through. So all frequencies are through, then we start cutting the lows, only allowing the highs through, and till none get through. So it's kind of like the reverse, but it gets a very different sound, as you can see, as we subtract the lows or we subtract the highs. It shapes our sound in a very different way. We also have a band pass, which if you're familiar with a wah-wah pedal on a guitar, that is a band pass filter. It's just moving the band of frequencies that are allowed through across the spectrum, and that sounds a bit like. So first thing we'll do is I'm going to choose the low pass filter, and with all analog filters, or all filters in synthesizer control, they'll have a resonance property to them, and the resonance is just like a harmonic bump around the frequency cutoff. This knob is known as the cutoff. It's the cutoff point where the frequencies start getting subtracted, and the angle, the rate at which those frequencies are cut off, some synths have the ability to change that slope. It's called the slope. How steeply they cut off changes the sound drastically. And then the resonance is how big that frequency bump. You can hear it gets very harmonic the more I increase the resonance. With no resonance, the sound is a bit more pure. So filter, cutoff and resonance really help us shape our sound. I'll come back to these in a moment. I'm going to skip over to the envelope. Now the envelope is kind of hard to describe without an image, so I'm just going to show this image. An envelope controls the amplitude, the volume, the level of voltage that is creating the signal over time, how loud it gets and then how quickly it gets back to silence again. And there are 4 components to the envelope. In this case we have 2 envelopes on the Neutron, and that's fairly typical. I mean, some synths have 3, 4, envelope generators, and the first one is primarily used for the amplitude, for the amp, for the volume. And so when we talk about volume, looking at my diagram here, the first part is called the attack. These envelopes are commonly, referred to as ADSR: attack, decay, sustain, and release. So let's look at that a component at a time. The attack is how quickly the sound reaches full volume after the key is struck. So with a very short attack, it's immediate, the sound is there. The more I increase the attack, the slower that sound ramps up, and you'll see it starts to sound more like a string or a bowed instrument. The next is decay, and decay works in tandem with sustain to control the next portion of the signal. Sustain is the level, the volume of the note once it sort of settles into its sustain portion. So we have the attack where it goes full volume, and then it will settle into the sustain portion. So the decay determines how long it takes after the initial sort of bite of the attack for it to drop. And if you look at the graph here, you can see the attack ramps up, the decay sort of ramps back down, and it sort of stays level to the sustain. And sustain basically means how long the note is held down. That note is sustained because I'm holding it down. And sustain lasts up until the key is released, the release point. And you can see here we have key on and key off. So decay and sustain work in tandem to create the overall sort of body of the sound. Now release determines how quickly the sound fades after the note has been released. If we look at the graph here, we can see how long how that works. We have the release time, and that creates that final downslope on the envelope. Okay, so that's the amp envelope. The second envelope, it behaves in the same way, ADSR, exact same thing, except it can be used to control other aspects of the sound. In this case, by default, it's piped through to the envelope. If I go back to the overhead, the envelope depth here, it controls the filter. So I can have the filter open and close following that envelope path, or that envelope shape. So you can see with the get some cool sound design, some cool shape, give some character to our music. Up which I haven't discussed yet, is the LFO, the low frequency oscillator. And that's not to be confused with like a subwoofer. The low frequency oscillator is an oscillator, much like the oscillators over here, that move back and forth in time in the same way we've got sine wave through triangle, through shark fin, through square, through sawtooth, and the waveforms behave exactly the same the way that the oscillators in the sound generation portion of the synth do, except they can, much like the envelope, controls an element, in this case the filter over time. The LFO can be sent to control many aspects of the sound over time. And in this case, again, it's defaulting to control the filter cutoff. It can open and close the filter over time at a rate defined by this knob here, and in a shape defined by this knob here. If we turn the envelope down, and this blue light here is really cool. It gives us an indication of what the LFO is doing. You can see the filter envelope, the filter cutoff is opening and closing over time at a slow rate. Now I can increase this. And with the LFO and the envelope, I can So what I was doing now is taking the LFO up into what they call audio frequency. The LFO was no longer LF, it was no longer low frequency, it was up into the audio frequency. It was moving so fast, it was actually acting like a third oscillator and creating some, what was arguably rather nasty or rather cool, depending on your perspective, I guess. But that's how the LFO can be used. Right now I've got it on a square wave, so it's like an on-off filter, and you can hear it's of the envelope and the LFO, you can really start to sculpt your sound. And this is what the whole principle of subtractive synthesis. We're chiseling away at the bass tone, this big lump of marble, trying to reveal the beauty, the statue of David that is hidden within. And next, every synth is slightly different. They all have an oscillator, a filter, and an envelope section, and an LFO. Then beyond that, what the synth offers us depends on the manufacturer. So Neutron has a nice tones section where I can start with a pure tone. I can make it brighter, exaggerate the higher frequencies, or exaggerate the lower frequencies, which is kind of cool. And it also has a nice nice overdrive, so I can have a level there, so I can sort of gain correct. That's going to really warm up the drives it, warms up the. Here, making sure I don't clip. Easily get a little bit too hot. This drive function. That's really, really cool. So, as well as that, we have our analog bucket brigade delay, which is really nice to have on board without having to use like I'll often use a guitar pedal, but for reverb and delay and chorus and some effects. But it's nice to have an onboard delay. And let's start with and again, it's kind of cool for some, special effecty type of stuff. Sci-fi sort of sound design thing. And with low times, I can create more of like a chorusy flanging sound. Especially if I use the LFO to sort of modulate the delay time, which I'm doing manually here. Get some cool chorusy flanging. Increase the times, I can get some nice little repeats. Also, I can take the repeats up, the feedback up into like self-oscillation mode. Again, that's really great for science fiction-y, special effecty type of stuff when you can start messing with that. And at the core of analog synthesis is the fact, they call them knobby synths for a reason, and that's not a derogatory term. A knobby synth means it's got all its functions on the surface. It's not like, when digital synthesis, started to emerge, late 70s, 80s. You started to get menus and menu diving and buttons, and there was a lot of clicking and modal controls, so it was not easy to control several parameters at once. Like I was twisting two knobs at the same time to control a sound. Digital synthesizers, especially early ones and especially more compact ones, are much harder to control like that. Now you can always, I don't have my beat step, you can always get some kind of rotary MIDI encoder to control a digital synth. They're going to be controlled by MIDI, and you can set MIDI CC controls to something like that. But there's a purity, there's something about having all those controls on the surface. You can see what is set at what. There's no digital readout where you have to kind of guess, what setting was this knob set at. Everything's there on the surface for you to see, and it's great fun to manipulate that sound on the fly. Digital can create, you can get 8, 16, oscillators and voices a lot easier and a lot cheaper and a lot more compact than you can with analog, so there's obviously benefits to both. But there's something really fun about playing with the surface, the controls on the surface of an analog synth. There's some other controls here, sample and hold, that's more modulation that can be patched to control other things. I won't get into that right now. And we have like glide, portamento, controls how two notes slide into each other. And we have these attenuators that are more related to the patch bay here. Again, I won't get into, just talking about the sort of basic, sound design properties of synthesizers. So I'm gonna have a little play here. I didn't forget to mention that there is a noise, like a white noise feature. You can dial in noise, and usually add a little bit of noise to make the sound a bit more airy. But it's also great for those sort of filter sweeps, give them a bit of density. So there you have it, analog synthesis, hardware, knobby synthesizer that is hands-on, fun to play, and I mean that was just a 3-note arpeggiation that was just playing over and over and over. I wasn't playing anything complex. I'm not a keyboardist. I'm a composer. I can arrange the notes into a harmonious fashion, but I'm not a keyboard performer. But the arpeggiator just allows me to set a little loop effectively and run, and then just let the controls on the synthesizer let me do my performance. And that is, it's definitely an investment and a step up from sort of free iPad synth, vintage synth models, hardware emulations. But I wanted to sort of demonstrate how much fun it is. I wanted to show what the origins really of synthesis. When the likes of Bob Moog and those early explorers in the 60s were looking at generating sound through voltage controlled oscillators and those huge modular systems. That's the origins of synthesis, and this is what it looks like today. And there's a lot of much more affordable. I mean, you're not paying tens of thousands of dollars for a synth that's the size of a wall. You can get a great package in a box like this for not a huge outlay comparatively. I mean, it's the price of a guitar. So if you're into that sort of thing, or if you've played with software synthesizers before and you've weren't sure like where to dip your toe in the analog or the hardware synth market, you could go. This is such a versatile, flexible piece of equipment, and you could go do a lot worse. There's a lot of choice out there. It's never been a better time to invest in in synthesizers for equipment. So but I love the Neutron. It's a lot of fun. Hope this inspired you to whet your musical appetite this weekend. Stay indoors, stay healthy, don't go to the pubs or the restaurants. Help everyone out, help your grandma out, right? You know what I'm talking about. And stay in, make some music, be creative. And until next week, until the next creative briefing, I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.